Hey, a lot of people have, when they talk about my messages, and so they've kind of called me like the king of the props or the master of the illustrated messages. So I want to take just a few minutes here just to give you my tips on how to have a successful illustrated message. And the first thing you got to start off is with the content. That's very important. Got to decide what content you're going to be talking about. Make sure you know the content, make sure you've memorized it, make sure you know what you're talking about. And so that's the key stage right there. Before you even come up with any props or visuals, you got to make sure you've got some good content and you know how to communicate that content. And then the next thing you need to come up with is to gather the props. Now this is the fun part right here, because usually what I start with after I come up with the content, and then I sit in a room by myself and I begin to visualize what are some of the images that can help me reinforce the content that I'm going to be communicating that day. And so I'll spend about an hour just going through different pictures in my mind of different props that I could bring onto the stage or the venue that I'm speaking at. And so once I identify those props and I feel pretty comfortable about them, I kind of narrow them down. One thing you don't want to do is to have too many props on stage, depending on the size of the stage. If it's a small venue, then you don't want to clutter that with a bunch of props. But if it's a larger stage, then you can feel free to use your liberty and have a few extra props. And so once I've got the content, I've got the props, and then the third thing is super important. You got to remember this point number 3, because if you don't do point number 3, you'll mess up the whole message. So point number 3 is you have to practice. Practice is a must. And so what I mean by practicing, number 1, you've already got the content down, you feel pretty comfortable with the content. Well, you've got to practice with those props, meaning how to use those props on stage while you're speaking. A lot of times what I do is I have my assistant put all my props out on the stage or the venue that I'm speaking at, and I'll go in there by myself and walk around the stage communicating to empty chairs while using those props, because I want to make sure that number 1, that the props don't fall apart on stage. I don't knock them over. I want to make sure I'm very familiar with handling those props while I'm communicating. I want to be come across very natural while I'm communicating with those props. So I'll go into the room by myself, turn the lights on, and I'm speaking to empty chairs like it was thousands of people out there, but I'm interacting with those props. I'm making sure I'm practicing with them, and so to the point to where I am very comfortable with communicating while using props on stage. And another great reason why you use those props is because you want people to remember. You want people to remember your message, which brings us to point number 4. My last point is interaction. You got to have interaction with those props. And what I mean by there, when you're speaking with those props, and you don't want to just refer to them one time. You want to make sure that you are walking around with those props. I remember a while back I did a message called Mind Monsters, and I had this little pinata on stage with me, little dragon here, and he represented the mind monsters. We all have those thoughts that come into our mind that we call mind monsters, and they'll drive you crazy if you let them. And so what I did while I was communicating, talking about mind monsters and how to defeat the mind monster, I walked around carrying this little mind monster. Sometimes I'd put him on my shoulder, or I have him speaking into my ear. And you say that's funny, but listen, that's called interaction, and that is a key to a very successful illustrated message. And so you'll be amazed of how many times I walk into a restaurant and somebody comes up and say, hey, you're the pastor that was on stage with that monster, carrying around that monster. And they were able to tell me all the points in my message. So the key to illustrated messages, you gotta interact, because people will forget what you say. No matter how good you're a speaker, people will forget your content, but when you have that illustration and that visual, they'll remember that visual and it will bring back their content. Listen, I'm telling you, do it. Follow these steps and you'll be great at illustrated messages.